So, before this chapter begins, I wanted to put a brief disclaimer that there will be graphic depictions of violence. And so, if you want to avoid that, I will have the times listed up here. And I will also have it in the chapters and in the description as well. So, if you want to avoid these graphic depictions of violence, then skip whatever times I figure out them to be, and that's kind of it. Enjoy the story. Interlude of Magic. Jaden stared up at the starry night. He's never actually seen the stars. Too much light pollution. He never realized how pretty they were. On a background of dark blue and purple, a large green and red streak arched across the sky, complemented by smaller circular bursts of lime green and orange. Bright white dots of stars were scattered across the sky. It was sublime. The fatigue he felt when Magic said he should sleep went away as soon as they vanished. Now all he felt was a slight buzzing of excitement as he lay in the sleeping bag, staring up at the starry night. "I thought I told you to sleep." Magic's voice suddenly came from Jaden's left. The mortal snapped his head to look over at God. "I couldn't," Jaden responded, before turning to look back up at the sky. "What you looking at?" Magic asked. "The stars," Jaden said. "Stars?" Magic questioned, before looking up to see what the mortal was talking about. "Oh, you mean those. Sit up." Jaden crawled out of the sleeping bag and stood up, with an expectant look on his face. "Hold on a minute," Magic said. They looked up at the false sky, before reaching a hand towards it. They batted the lights around with their hand, searching for something. Magic's eyes lit up when they found what they were looking for. Their fingers encircled one of the lights before they plucked the object from the sky. They lowered their hand, still holding the bright object. Magic regarded the object in their hand for a moment. "Catch," was the only warning Jaden got, before Magic threw the object towards him. The hybrid scrambled to properly catch the bright object, considering the halo of light made it seem bigger than what it actually was. Jaden ended up using both hands to clasp around the object. He opened his hands and held the object between his thumb and finger. The object was about the size of a glass marble, and whatever it was made of was fragile. Extremely fragile. If he put enough pressure on it, the object would most certainly... "Don't do that." Magic's voice cut through the boy's thoughts. "I really don't want to remake all of that," they said, before pulling another one of the objects down from the sky. Except it was larger than the one Jaden held. "Seeing as how I've yet to turn to ash, I am assuming this isn't a star?" Jaden said, holding up the object. "Nope," Magic chirped. "Well, it contains stars, but it's a bit bigger than a star." "What is it then?" "Your universe was not the first one made, nor is it alone. You are holding not only your own universe, but all the other universes related to yours. You are holding your multiverse." Magic crossed their legs in the air. The multiverse they were holding floated in front of them. "You asked if I was Omnibenevolence. What does that mean, really? All good? To what extent? To what degree? Mortals can be so stupid and limited in their understanding." Magic took a deep breath of air. "I wouldn't say I'm Omnibenevolence. No, I'll let you humans decide on that." Magic gestured to the ground in front of them. "Sit, and let me tell you the story about this universe. Then you may decide whether or not I am Omnibenevolence." Magic gave Jaden an empty smile, as he thought back to those first few moments of their consciousness. In the beginning, there was nothing. Except, within the nothingness, everything existed. Except, everything didn't exist within the nothing. There is no such thing as existence. There was nothing. No heat, no cold, no thoughts, no feelings, no emotions. Just an empty and ceaseless void. Except something had to be there in order to acknowledge that nothing. Something had to be there. Had to be there. Some things were then there. Newborns were probably the closest things that could understand what those first things felt when they first stirred, is probably the closest word that could equate to what happened. 6 things suddenly existed, and it was most certainly not a peaceful affair. Simultaneously, 6 voiceless voices cried out. Except they couldn't cry, for they had no bodies. They had no lungs to fill. Agonyless agony echoed across the void. A questionless question was on the mindless minds of the 6. Why? A cacophony of soundless sound of that questionless question from the 6. In the beginning, there was chaos. Then the 7th showed itself and quelled the 6. The 7th might have been older than the 6, or maybe it was younger. Time did not exist. Nothing existed. The 7th seemed to be wiser and more used to the void in a way the 6 were not. The 7th opened the 6's eyeless eyes. Then the 6 could and could not see. The 7 were formless and shapeless, both abstract and concrete. In the beginning, there was nothing, and simultaneously everything. The 7 didn't have a purpose. They didn't know what they could and could not do. They couldn't even communicate with each other, except for pushing primitive and wordless thoughts and emotions. And even that was limited, as those things didn't even exist properly. But despite all of that, the 7 could align on one simple thing. They did not like the void. The 7 wanted to do something about the void. They were all omnipresent, omniscient, and omnipotent. Then again, within the void, anything that is present is omnipresent. In the void, even the most dim-witted individuals would be omniscient, for no one would possess more knowledge than that individual. In the void, even the most impotent would wield all the power in existence. With 7 omniscient things, a solution on how to deal with the void was concocted. The 7 learned and knew that their essence could produce something, so they did what they could. They put in as much power into their concocted idea, without some grand declaration or even a loud bang. The first universe was created. A rudimentary thing spanning infinity. It was full of small, grainy objects that looked like sand, but it clearly wasn't, considering its blue-white tint, and the radiation would immediately kill anyone if they weren't meant for this realm, or if they were not given the proper protection. For being created by 7 omnipotent and omnipresent things, using even a fraction of their power to generate something, would mean that the thing would possess an infinite amount of whatever those beings desired. The 7 felt no sense of pride or joy at the new thing, only relief. The 7 gathered a majority of themselves to put into the new thing. They were still amorphous things, but now they had something. Something existed within the existence-less. But it wasn't enough. There was still an endless expanse of the void. This new thing may have been infinite in size, but ultimately it was little more than a minute blemish on the void. The 7 knew that they could make more, but they first needed a means of communication. It would be easier and more efficient that way. The 7 descended upon the new universe, as they started to trace out lines and patterns into the grains. Eventually, they gave meaning to those shapes and patterns, and thus they finally had a way to communicate with each other faster than before. Seeing how small of an impact the 7 made into the void, they decided to seek a way to refine what they made. So they continued to create singular universes, changing and altering the conditions that would create these new universes. They quickly figured that altering the forces that made up these universes would alter how the universe would function. If some forces were too strong, the universe that would be made would either quickly implode in on itself and become a mess of particles, or even form clumps of matter that would prove to be useless. If the forces were too weak, oftentimes the universe would fizzle out into nothingness, or even force the creation of more matter, which meant nothing except scattered particulates floating in a void. However, for them, the creators, these failures were meaningless, for they had no goal other than to fill the void. So, endlessly, they continuously forged universe after universe, until creating one where everything was just right. Gravity didn't crush everything into dust. Nuclear force created just enough matter to outweigh the antimatter that was formed as well. It was also just strong enough so a diverse and plentiful amount of molecules would also form. Energy was perhaps the most fickle and erratic. The amount of energy that was used was almost a non-factor. Sure, if there wasn't enough energy in a universe, it would quickly fizzle out into nothingness, ending before even starting. But if there was a high level of energy within a universe, it would eventually coagulate into something different, something that could potentially warp the fabric of the created reality if used correctly. Within that specific universe, however, there was a moderate amount of energy within that universe. Nothing special or seemingly abnormal would occur in that universe. A similar thing applied to matter and antimatter, considering when matter was generated in a universe, an equal amount of antimatter would also generate, and vice versa. It wasn't perfect, but then again, nothing is ever perfect. But it was adequate. It wasn't anything special to the Seven, so once they made it, they left it. They continued on their self-made mission. They continued to forge universe after universe, until they took notice of that lone universe that had something unusual within it. Sapient life. While life wasn't unusual to them, it was only sentient at best. But these creatures had both at once. They had terraformed their planets, creating large and vast structures and complex machinery. The Seven were aware of everything, but most of the time that awareness of everything was little more than a backdrop for everything else. They typically didn't give much attention to universes that had life, but the life in this universe was different. More complex, more interesting. They were interested in these creatures, so they stopped creating and started to watch these creatures. They were little more than apes, but it seemed like they had transcended, or rather broke free, from the confines of nature. For these animals who ordained themselves as humans, creation and innovation that was non-existent in a universe made before and after. The Seven watched these creatures with some level of awe. Their world, Earth as they called it, had a sort of beauty to it, something that they could see but had not truly experienced before. They watched, they learned, and they wanted. Humans were interesting. They had potential, a lot of potential. They were malleable things, quick to learn and adapt, but they were flawed. They were violent, overly emotional, unnecessarily cruel. But these traits can be corrected, mended. The Seven felt that they had to try. They wanted to see what humanity's peak was. The species deserved it. They would show this ideal world to these creatures and better their lives. And so, for the first time, the Seven created something for a different reason. Prior to the creation of the new universe, the Seven acknowledged that they needed a physical form in order to properly interact with the mortals, and names so their creations could differentiate between them. The Seventh looked at a different universe containing life, long, serpentine creatures born from the coagulation of excess energy. So the Seven took the forms of these creatures that would soon be known as dragons, When it came to their names, the two who came up with their names first would be matter and antimatter. Matter was what the mortals called the building blocks of their universe, and the one who called themselves matter was the one who propagated those building blocks. The name antimatter came about due to the nature of the one who would call themselves that. If matter was propagated within a universe, they too would also propagate in an equal amount, destroying any matter that would come into contact with them. And even though they had difficulties interacting with many universes that were made, with enough effort and the assistance of two others, they could enter a universe with no issue. The third to come up with a name would be the one known as gravity. They followed what matter and antimatter did and looked to that previous universe for inspiration. They propagated what those mortals called gravitational force. They bent and influenced space and time to their will, as well as bound everything together. So gravity would be an apt name. The others decided to follow suit. The one who propagated electrical charges and lights would be the one known as electromagnetism. The one who propagated and bound atoms together would call themselves nuclear. The last two were harder to define. One propagated essentially everything, being the spark for a universe to begin, and having some kind of connection to the others, whilst the other did what the six did combined, and seemed to hold some kind of greater and more abstract command over the six. Energy would be the best name for the being that gave enough power to propagate a universe into being. Father would be the name given to the seventh, the one that had influence over the other six, the one that had helped the six open their eyes. Around this time, the seven would specialize in certain aspects of themselves, finding comfort and strength in the preferred aspect. Matter and antimatter would prefer the knowledge granted to them by their omniscience. Together, they would represent the greater and lesser forms of omniscience, respectively. Being the two that existed wherever anything existed, gravity and electromagnetism would represent omnipresence in its greater and lesser extent, with gravity being more omnipresent than electromagnetism. The last two held the most power compared to the rest, holding both abstract and literal power in equal parts. Energy and nuclear would both represent omnipotence in its greater and lesser extent, with energy holding more omnipotence than nuclear. Whilst the last of the seven, Father, was the most unique of the group. Rather than fitting in with the rest by representing one of their aspects, they seemed to have more of an abstract command over their aspects. It wasn't that they embodied their aspects. It was more like they defined their aspects, and by proxy, the rest of the six's aspects. And with names and bodies, the seven created a new universe, this time with a purpose. The seven only took 7 days to form this new universe. They had mirrored the surviving animals from the previous universe, creating a vast and complicated chain for the And with names and bodies, the seven created a new universe, this time with a purpose. The seven only took 7 days to form this new universe. They had mirrored the surviving animals from the previous universe, creating a vast and complicated chain for the ecosystem. When they had finished, they started to form their first humans. From the clay they found, the seven sculpted their humans. Tens of thousands of mortals would be created, each of which made for a specific purpose. From the arts to the sciences, each mortal and their progeny would be born to do certain things. Humanity was stripped of its autonomy, but still retained its free will. The seven ruled over their creations with constant guidance. They dictated everything a person could and would do, every thought, every action. Humanity was little more than some glorified puppets, constantly being puppeteered by the beings that made them. However, unlike puppets, mortals still had a sense of free will. They wanted things the creators kept away from them. They desired to express their own will upon their worlds. They wished to live. For centuries, humanity was made to do and work on things they couldn't fully understand. Under the guise of being considered special and important, they were merely slaves for their 7 masters. In life, humanity had no sense of freedom, no will to call their own. However, that only applied to life. In the back of their mind, humanity knew that true freedom from their born captivity came from death. Only in death could they be free from their master's will. The 7 have never shown any interest in the deceased. They have not brought back the dead, nor did it seem like they intended to. They had long since learned that their masters never grew tired, never had a reason to sleep, and were always aware of everything that happened, no matter how minute. So collectively, humanity waited for a time when their lords would lose interest, when they would turn their gaze away from them. They only needed a minute to enact their goal of freedom. And so they waited. 1,000 years passed, 2,000, 3,000, until 5,000 years had finally elapsed. The 7 had gotten humanity to its theoretical peak once 5,000 years of civilization had passed. Mortals were able to harvest resources from the stars, and had technology that even the most intelligent person couldn't envision. The 7 could see that this was humanity's current peak, and yet they saw how improvements could easily be made. But it didn't matter. They were proud of what they had done. With their mission complete, the 7 left the universe temporarily. They shifted their gaze away from their creations, and humanity sensed that brief moment of neglect. Fearing they wouldn't have another opportunity like this ever again, they acted quickly, and almost instantly. Tools that were made to help other people quickly became weapons to kill their peers. Cars quickly swerved into one another, as people slammed down onto their gas pedals, not letting up until death finally came over them. People found the highest point that was available to them and jumped off. Those by the water tied heavy objects to themselves and let their bodies sink into the water. Fires were started and never extinguished as mortals used themselves continuously to fuel the flames. Humanity slaughtered one another, painting their world red. It hardly lasted longer than 10 minutes, but the deed was done. Humanity had caused its own extinction. The omniscients were aware of the event, as well as the greater omnipresence, but their gaze wasn't turned towards that universe. After all, just because one is aware of something, it doesn't mean they'll pay any attention to it. Only when the last human drew their final breath did the 7 decide to investigate. The 7 dragons returned to that world, and it was clear something was wrong. There was silence, pure and omnipresent. There were massive fires burning wildly, with blackened bones and burnt clothes in the middle of the pyres, fueling the flames. Streets and buildings were painted red with blood, and corpses lined the sidewalks. The 7 didn't know why they even bothered to check if there were any survivors, for they already knew the truth. Their humans were dead. The Greater Omnipotent decided to revive one of the mortals, in order to understand what happened. Alas, the resurrected mortal only cried out in agony, before running their head through a nearby ice pick. The message was clear. Humanity didn't want to live under the rule of the 7. The 7 had created this universe with the intention to share and improve the other universe. But their mortals did not appreciate the leadership of the 7. It was a one-sided competition, one that the 7 had definitively lost. They immediately felt anger at that realization. How could they have lost to a bunch of mortals who commit acts of war and violent atrocities to themselves and others? What had the 7 done wrong? The ire of the 7 turned to the innocent universe. If the humans of their universe do not want to live in what can only be described as utopia, then no human shall live. The 7 had concocted a plan. Even if only 6 of the 7 could actually see their plan through, it would still be perfect. The 7 took forms that resembled the mortals before descending upon that world. They presented themselves as friends, and gain the trust of the humans. People wished to see and meet the foreigners from space. The 6 that were present proposed that they toured across the 7 continents, with the exception of Antarctica. Father would go to Africa. Energy would go to North America. Gravity would go to Europe. Matter would go to South America. Nuclear would go to Australia. And electromagnetism would go to Asia. Then, 1 month into their tours, the 6 revealed their true intentions. They reassumed their draconic forms, as they declared themselves to be the creators of this universe, before scorning humanity and its existence. Then they rained fire from their mouths, scorching anyone and anything into ash. No one survived the 6's attack. When the 6 saw that there was nothing but ash left, their fury faded away.
So, still think I'm omnibenevolent?
Magic said. Jaden sat back and let out a breath. I have questions.
I'll give you 10 before I put you to sleep. And before you ask, yes, I am energy. Me and radiation changed our names after some time.
I kind of figured. Well, not radiation, but whatever. If you were angry at humanity, why do we exist?
After some time, we cooled off and resurrected both worlds, before wiping the memories of the original. Afterwards, we started to make universes with mortals in them.
The 7th, Father. Are they older or younger than the rest of you? Jaden asked. Magic let out a hum.
Don't know. We have asked matter and antimatter about this, but even they're not sure about this. Matter said no, but Ant hesitated before concurring, which means they had differing answers. What makes this all the more confusing is that we are higher dimension things. Time isn't really something that can be applied to us, and so we don't really know. By the way, these questions kinda suck, Magic said with a lopsided grin. It's kinda hard to come up with good questions when there's no limits, Jaden argued. Magic pursed her lips before letting out a hum. I suppose you're right. I'll drop the question limit, but you only get to ask one more thing before you go to sleep,
Magic said. Jaden thought about what he was going to ask. It had to be good. He didn't want to ask something meaningless. But what do you ask God? God. Oh. Jaden opened his mouth and spoke. Are you a god? Magic tilted her head before smiling.
No, I am not.
Then what are you?
You used your last question already. Besides, you already know that answer.
Magic stood up and flicked a finger up. Both multiverses that Jaden and Magic held shot up into the sky, returning to their original positions among those false stars. Magic turned to walk away before vanishing completely. Sensing that was the end of conversation tonight, Jaden lied back down, facing the sky. He was immediately hit with a wave of exhaustion. But his mind was still swirling with the question of what is magic. They once called themselves energy, and then magic. But that didn't mean much. They said he already knew that answer. Wait, why did they name themselves what they did? Jaden's final thought before he succumbed to the darkness of sleep was the omnipotent known as magic.